Hello, welcome to this presentation on Perkins 5 and federal budgeting rules and practices. We are heading into the budgeting phase of next year's Perkins grant. In this presentation, I hope to clarify a number of rules around grant spending practices that are important for you as CTE coordinators to know. First, we'll do a little level setting related to the key themes or priorities of the Perkins 5 law. We'll walk through the main considerations that determine the allowability of an expense, and then we'll wrap up with the WISE Grants budget section and how to input your information correctly. So let's start with the main themes. Perkins 5 builds on Perkins 4 by advancing data-driven decision-making through the Comprehensive Local Needs Assessment, CLNA process, enhanced efforts to serve special population groups of students through accessible practices, continuous improvement through the student performance on Perkins accountability indicator measures, and implementation of quality career pathways as defined by the state. In other words, Perkins 5 goes way beyond Perkins 4. It requires recipients of funds to look at what's truly working to move the needle forward for your programs rather than simply maintain them, and move away from practices that are not improving outcomes. This new approach has actually opened up opportunities for grant recipients to pivot from what's always been done to taking the next steps towards robust quality career pathways and engagement of all students through new and innovative ways. So let's take a deeper dive into the first key theme, data-driven decision-making. Data-driven decision-making means making CTE program decisions based on data that tells you improvement is needed to achieve positive outcomes, targeting your activities to the greatest needs of special population students. This is done by first identifying your data gaps related to those themes that we just went over, identifying the main reason or root cause for the gaps. Then you identify the activities, strategies, or programs that will address or tackle that root cause. And all purchases must align with the activity that will mitigate the root cause so that you will no longer have a data gap. This is to say, when you determine your budget, all of your budget items must be tied to correcting or mitigating the root cause of your data gap and improve your outcomes. So who are the special population students targeted by Perkins for assistance? These are students who are known to experience various roadblocks to engagement or persistence in CTE. That is why your data and activities should be focused on gaps you see for these students. We'll talk about that more in the upcoming CLNA presentation. The special population groups targeted to ensure equitable engagement in all CT programs, include those listed here. Students with disabilities that include physical, behavioral, cognitive, from economically disadvantaged families, so perhaps they can't afford engagement in some aspects of CTE, preparing for national non-traditional occupational fields, English learners who may miss opportunities due to limited communication or discrimination, those experiencing homelessness as described in McKinney-Vento, experiencing or those who have aged out of foster care, single parents youth with a parent who's in active duty with the armed forces, and also included are disenfranchised subgroups targeted under ESSA, which include racial and ethnic minority groups and migrant students. The third focus is continuous improvement process. This entails examining what your data is telling you about the success of your students according to prescribed indicators. Set a plan or goal to improve your outcomes on these indicators every year. The indicators are the percentage of senior CTE concentrators who graduate high school, the percentage of senior CTE concentrator proficiency in the state academic standards of science, math, reading, and language arts based on their junior year ACT, the percentage of recently graduated CTE concentrators who 6 months after exiting high school are in advanced training, are employed in military service, or volunteering, and the percentage of senior CTE concentrators in programs that lead to non-traditional fields. The measure of CTE program quality in our state, that is the percentage of CTE concentrators who participate in a qualified work-based learning at any time during high school. The fourth priority is quality career pathways as defined by the state. This means that pathways are approved by the state, align with regional and state projected labor market needs. There's a sequence of courses in the pathway from introductory to more advanced, and then two of the following: either work-based learning experiences aligned with the pathway, industry recognized credentials aligned with the pathway, dual credit course aligned with the pathway, and a CTSO aligned with the pathway. This means that in order to spend any Perkins funds on a pathway, it must meet the required size, scope, and quality as defined in Appendix A. And as we've just gone over, there must be a data gap and root cause to which you will target funding. You can find information about the Appendix A size, scope, and quality on the DPI Perkins website. So, if those are the priorities of Perkins, what things aren't? Well, doing what's always been done. In other words, doing the same thing without seeing improved student outcomes. Maintaining the old, meaning old practices and old spending decisions. Opinions on what's good for kids, but having no data behind it. This is to say that all kinds of experiences are good for kids, but it doesn't mean that the federal grant funds can or should be spent on them. Perkins 5 added that strategies and activities that will be implemented to improve outcomes must be evidence-based as defined by ESSA. And that goes along with the previous bullet, that activities you implement, things you spend money on, must demonstrate an effect on improving a data outcome. So based on the themes of the law, how does an applicant determine what is allowable for spending when there is so much that's needed in our schools and for our students? Keep in mind that Perkins is just one funding source that can be tapped into, and that there are requirements you have to meet to use it. So let's move our discussion from understanding the priorities of the grant to understanding how you determine allowability of your expenses, keeping the priorities in mind. The law states that purchases shall be based on the needs reflected through the results of the Comprehensive Local Needs Assessment. It also states that the results of your CLNA must be shared in the Perkins grant application. So what does that mean? It means that expenses must be tied to the needs reflected in the CLNA results that you shared in your application. As an example, this slide reflects the connection between the data gap and planned spending. The data gap on the left reflects a root cause, as does the data gap on the right. However, the activities that will be implemented are different for each of them. The first root cause has one activity that will be addressed. The second data gap, let's say, has two activities that are going to address the root cause and purchases that are aligned with those activities. In the end, your goal should be eliminating the data gap, or at least reducing it by using Perkins funds to do so. You can also use other funds to do it. So you don't have to reduce a data gap using Perkins funds, but you do have to address a gap. The clearer the line from the data gap to the root cause of those gaps and what you're going to do about it, the easier your budget approval process will be. When you consider the allowability of a purchase, you want to make first pay attention to the law that dictates a particular grant. So far, that's what we've been focused on in this presentation. Second, you need to consider the federal grant rules. And these rules are articulated in the Uniform Grant Guidance, which are regulations that overarch all federal funding, and the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, or EDGAR for short, which are specific to grants from the Federal Department of Education. Both sets of regulations need to be followed. To help you understand the regulations, DPI created the Allowable Cost Checklist as a resource for LEAs and DPI grant reviewers to use in determining the general allowability of a purchase according to UGG and EDGAR. I'm going to walk through the checklist at a very high level today. For a deeper understanding, you may also reference DPI's allowable costs under UGG slide presentation. In general, allowable costs refers to items of cost that may be funded with federal grant dollars as long as the costs fit within a framework of responsible stewardship of public funds. That framework is what we'll cover in the next few slides. It doesn't matter how great a purchase is if it doesn't fall within the regulations. So let's get started. Is the cost necessary to carry out the plan of the federal program, in our case, Perkins 5? A cost is necessary if it meets an important program objective to address an existing need. Perkins law states that the need is determined through the CLNA process. Is the cost reasonable? Have agency purchasing and procurement procedures been followed? Is the cost in line with fair market prices for comparable goods and services? Would a prudent person agree that the item being purchased and the cost is reasonable? A cost is reasonable if in its nature and amount it does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person. So what does prudent mean? Prudent is acting with or showing care and thought, sensible, well-advised, cautious, economical, vigilant, and discerning. Conforming to limitations or exclusions. This means that the cost has to conform to cost principles in federal statutes, regulations, limitations, or exclusions. For example, is the cost permissible and not disallowed under the 55 specific items of cost found in UGG? Keeping in mind that the 55 items are not exhaustive of every possible expenditure and leave a lot of gray areas as well. So the law provides guidance called basic considerations to be applied to any planned purchase. Is the cost permissible under program statute and regulations? Is the cost permissible under the terms and conditions of the grant subaward and assurances that agencies signed? Is the cost permissible under state statute? Is the cost permissible under the agency, DPI, and local policies? Because of these last two bullets, there can be differences between states as to what is allowed for spending. Consistent with policies and procedures. Are the LEA's policies and procedures consistent among funding sources? Do the LEA's policies and procedures apply the same rules for federal programs as they do for state and local programs? In other words, is the cost the same whether or not it's being funded by the grant or local funds? For example, if travel is paid from local funds is $1 amount, then there cannot be a separate or higher cost for employees utilizing federal funds for travel. Another example, if an LEA's policy does not reimburse employees for professional association membership or travel to a conference, then the LEA can't reimburse the cost just because federal funds are available. This is all to say that you can't apply a different set of rules to Perkins funds than you have for other funding sources. Accorded consistent treatment. Is the cost excluded from the agency's indirect cost rate? This means that a cost may not be assigned to the grant as a direct cost if the same type of cost has already been allocated as an indirect cost. And again, is the cost treated the same for federal program as it is for state and local funding? So one example is that salaries of clerical staff in schools are normally treated as an indirect cost. And so it must be that for Perkins as well. However, it could be a direct administrative cost if the clerical service is integral to the outcomes of the grant project. In other words, the individuals involved are specifically tied to a project or activity and have the written approval of the awarding agency for the percent of time on that project. Next is the cost allocable. A cost is allocable to a particular grant if the goods or services involved are assigned to the federal award in accordance with relative benefits received. In other words, to what extent are the expenditures charged to the grant benefiting the program? For example, when a recipient charges 100% of funds to a purchase, the program the LEA must ensure that the program is receiving 100% of the benefit of that cost. So if a rental of a bus for business and industry tour is being charged 100% for that rental of the bus, then it has to be for that purpose and not for all students. So if it's for CTE, then it can't be charged like for all students to participate. Another example would be that you can't charge the award to overcome deficiencies in another award. So for example, you can't use Perkins funds because other funds have run out. The purchase is in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP for short. Is the cost determined in accordance with GAAP? GAAP is the standard framework of guidelines for financial accounting that your accountants use. It's generally known as or referred to as accounting standards or standard accounting practices. Next, the cost cannot be used for cost sharing or matching requirements. Costs supported with federal funds cannot be counted towards a matching or cost sharing obligation for any other federal grant program. Next, expenses have to be adequately documented. Do you have the documentation demonstrating the need, the purchase, and use of the item? This would be documentation of your CLNA results and how it connects to the purchase. There needs to be records regarding authorizations, obligations, balances, asset management, expenditures, income, and any interest. So document everything. If it's not documented, it's not real or it didn't happen. And finally, the cost must be supplemental in nature. Does the cost meet the supplemental requirements of the federal grant, which means that the funds are supplemental and does not supplant current funds being used? So in other words, you can't replace funds that are already being used for a purchase or activity with federal grant funds. The resource called Perkins 5 Budgeting with Crosswalk is your, I'll call it, Cliff Notes for budgeting. This budgeting guide incorporates the checklist we just went through, Perkins Law, and Wisconsin Perkins State Plan in determining the allowability of a cost. CTECs of fiscal agents are responsible for familiarizing yourselves with this and working with your business office personnel to ensure that UGG and EDGAR spending rules are being incorporated into your purchasing decisions. They are the financial experts and you are the program experts. Work together to submit a budget for your district or consortium that is approvable and in line with your CLNA needs, as well as all federal and state rules. Do not just enter items into your budget application without checking it against this document first. And please don't submit a budget and just wait to see what gets approved or not by your reviewer. Your district is responsible for being familiar with grant rules and using the resources available, such as this document, to help you make the proper decisions. And we'll go through a few examples of what may or may not be approvable based on what was just discussed. So in this guide, you'll see there are links here for the allowable cost checklist, Wisconsin Uniform Financial Accounting Requirements, referencing everything that we just talked about. If there's an expense, there are assumptions that are made from the get-go, that it's tied to a need, it's necessary and proper, it's permissible, it's targeted to activities of students in 9th grade and above, which is in alignment with the Perkins, the Wisconsin State Plan, meets the requirements of UGG and EDGAR, and are taught, any courses are taught by a CTE licensed teacher. And so it has the different sections of the budget broken out. Here we have personnel, the type of salary and stipend, who it's for, whether it's allowed or not, and any additional guidance. The same for the purchase service section, common expenditures, and not every expenditure is in here, but the most common, and you can make a lot of decisions based on the guidance here. And of course, you can always reach out with specific questions. Here we have non-capital objects and capital objects and the other objects. Then you get to the crosswalk part. And a lot of people, this was added a few years ago, and I don't know that people are referencing it. So I want to point it out that this crosswalk has the headers for each of the focus areas of the CLNA and your application. So here we have the student performance and accountability indicators. Below it are the activities that were likely picked. You likely picked one of these activities if you had data gaps in this area. And it ties the activity to a likely purchase or a purchase that aligns best with that activity. Here we have the equity and access focus area. The activities that were available to you in the drop-down, and then the actual purchases that align best with those activities. Educator recruitment, retention, and training, the same thing. And of course, the career pathway evaluation activities, there's a lot more there. And example purchases, again, are on this far right column. So that can be really helpful in determining if a purchase is appropriate or not. So for every purchase, you determine its allowability. And in this example, this district may ask themselves, can we use Perkins funds to buy a dozen tablets for agriculture students to obtain and input data on site, or in the field, so to speak? Yes, through the CLNA, it was determined that it was necessary. I'm making some assumptions here. Obviously, I don't have the CLNA results in front of us today, but let's say it is necessary. Yes, let's say the cost is reasonable. In fact, they're going to get a deal on it. Yes, it's allocable to the grant and will be used 100% for agriculture classes and no other purpose. Yes, the LEA procurement process was followed. Yes, there is a plan for asset management. And no, it doesn't supplant funds. Excellent. This purchase will be approved. Here's another example of increasing electrical capacity in a CTE classroom. Yes, the CLNA did reflect that increasing the capacity is necessary. However, it's not something that's allocable under Edgar. This type of purchase is considered a building improvement, and any changes to a building structure, such as wiring or cable systems, among other building improvements, is considered a general district expense. So because it's not allocable or reasonable, and because district funds are normally used for improving building needs for educating students, it would be considered supplanting, and so this would not be approved. For this example, the LEA asks themselves, can they pay for economically disadvantaged students to travel for CTSO participation? Yes, if the CLNA root cause of the data gap of non-participation of this group of students in CTSOs is due to not being able to afford transportation, then that's a yes. Travel to a local or state event would be considered reasonable as long as it's by a bus and not by plane for no reason. There is not another funding source that has paid for this group of students in the past, so it's um, um, so not supplanting. But a word of caution that some schools, you may already be using Title I funds for these types of costs. So be careful that you're not supplanting one federal program costs with another. Now, what if using this example, what if the question was, could we do transportation for all students? When the data was disaggregated, the root cause of the non-participation of economically disadvantaged students was due to concerns about costs involved in travel. Well, if you want to spend it for all students, I guess you got to ask the question, who's paid for non-economically disadvantaged students in the past? And why would you supplant that with grant funds? Maybe the expectation in the district is that parents can provide the transportation, or that every student pays towards the transportation of a bus. And so these are things that have to be thought about before allocating federal funds in that example. So everything boils down to exercising the same discretion and good judgment that you would if you were using local funds. Hopefully, if you've got nothing else from this presentation, is that there are rules and strings attached to federal funds, and so you do need to work within those parameters. Okay, so let's move on to WISE Grants functionality. The two screenshots here show you how to get to the budget. After you pick the correct year to be working in, you'll select Perkins from the Programs tab at the top. So you'll drop down and select Perkins. Once you do that, this Applications tab will be viewable. And from the Application tab, you'll go down to the budget. You've already submitted your CLNA materials, and you're working on the budget. So you're going to click on budget, and then you're obviously working on the Perkins budget. Once you get to the budget section, you'll see drop-down menus across your screen for each budget section that a purchase may fall under: personnel, purchase services, non-capital objects, capital objects, other objects, and indirect costs. The first thing you do for any item you want to enter is to select the budget section for which you want to enter the information. So let's do a purchase service as an example. Once you click on purchase services, the next thing you'll have to do is select if the purchase is an administrative program type cost or a CTE program type cost. Everything you enter in a section will go into one of these two buckets, admin or CTE. Under Perkins, administration costs refers to tasks related to management of the grant and funding, including the application, budgets, and submitting the required reports. If you're the physical agent of a consortium, it means working with members on contracts and reimbursement of funds as well. Some administration costs are indirect, as we talked about a little while ago, which are general in nature, such as supplies, accounting, clerical, and others are more direct in nature, such as the CTE coordinator time for working on the application, the budget, and reports, basically doing the administrative requirements of the grant. CTE program costs refers to CTE program oversight, communication, training, and other instruction-related costs, such as curriculum, training, updating, equipment, things like that. Under each of those sections, you'll see, you'll be able to select from that search for budget combinations header. You'll be able to click and see what codes are already programmed into WISE grants. So we use woofer as our accounting coding strings. And so what is it that you plan on entering? So the combinations of codes, what codes align with each other, can be viewed before you even start entering your budget items. So using this to map out what you'll enter can be really helpful and will take the guesswork out of selecting from the drop downs. In this example, we're looking at a purchase service combinations because we're in the purchase service section of the budget. You can see under the header program type that there are administration and CTE purchase types. Oops. You can see the general purchase items. Are they related to a vendor contract, to travel, payment to a CISA or communication? I did it again. Is it for pupil transportation? Is it related to software? So this is just a screenshot of a much longer list that you can scroll through. Then you can see how the purchase item has purchase details, so it gets a little more detailed. These two columns are generally, at least for purchase services, are going to be not applicable. And then you have the function code, which are all the different function codes related to curriculum development and which vocational education area it's tied to, and then the object code. Depending on the drop-downs you select, red circles with arrows will indicate a required field. In this example, the program type CTE was selected. Once you select the appropriate program type purchase, you'll select the type of purchase. In this example, private vendor contract is selected. A private vendor is anyone that you're doing business with for a service. Next to it is the purchase detail, which is the thing that the purchase is for. In this case, CTE professional development, usually a registration fee. Then you select the correct function and object codes that align with each other. It's usually pretty clear from the drop-down what should be selected. If you have a question, ask your business manager. In this example, it's professional development for instructional staff. You'll put in the amount cost and then enter the detailed description. Requirements of the detailed description are in the Perkins 5 budget crosswalk document that we just looked at a little while ago. In the case of professional development registration, we want to see the name of the PD that's being attended, where it's being held, meaning the locale. So, is it in Florida? Is it in Wausau? Where is it being held? The number of individuals attending. The month can be helpful. That's not a deal breaker. And the reason for that is to make sure that it's being entered for the correct grant year. If required, you'll indicate if the purchase is tied to a CLNA focus area. If tied to a career pathway, you'll indicate the pathway. Sometimes the pathway is required and sometimes it isn't. Finally, you'll have to make the connection between the purchase and the activity you chose to address your data gap. In other words, you've indicated the activities you're going to mitigate the root cause. And so whatever you said in the application part of the Perkins application, whatever activities you identified to address the data gap, that is going to carry over to the budget section and will be available to you to choose from the drop down, but only those things where you said you were going to spend Perkins funds. You'll notice that the name of the pathway, as I just said, is not always required. The general ledger account and vendor are never required. These are for your agency to use. It's for your benefit. Some districts use those fields to enter certain information to keep their purchases organized, but it's not something that your reviewers will be looking at. And again, I'm referring to the general ledger account and the vendor fields. Those are never required, and don't fill them in unless you're going to use them. A reviewer will never look at those. Once you save a budget entry, it will look similar to these line items. We'll now go over some common do's and don'ts in the next few slides. The first column on the left is the purchase item that was entered. We have employee travel, and it's a private vendor contract. PD and instructional staff training was selected for the purchase detail and the function code. So far, so good. Where we run into problems with line items is often the description entered by the applicant. Can you identify the problems in this example? In the very first line of that description, it says convention registration is indicated as something being purchased. The problem is that the coding selected was for travel. Registration for a conference is not a travel cost. It's a registration cost. You're entering into an agreement with an agency to provide a service, in this case, PD. And so that would be coded differently. Also, there's no mention of how many people are attending. Our guidance states that the location and how many people the cost is covering should be entered. Further, the total cost doesn't align with the dollar amounts put in the description. This budget would be returned to the applicant for corrections. The second line is for a private vendor contract, also for PD, for instructional staff to attend 2 conferences as stated in the description. And the coding all seems to align, but there are 2 questions we'd have. First, how many people are attending and where is the conference located? That's not in the description. And this is how your reviewer knows if the cost is reasonable. And I'm not sure that the activity actually aligns with the purchase. The activity is related to student experiences. not teacher PD needs. So as a reviewer, I'd be going back to the CLNA results to make sure that this purchase aligns with the data gaps of, well, to see exactly what the data gaps are, because on one hand, we're talking about teacher training, and on the other hand, we're talking about student experiences, which contradicts a little bit. Here we have an example of the wrong way to code an item and a better way to code an item. The first line is wrong because communication under woofer refers to a thing or a service that is being purchased in order to communicate. Healthcare manager stipend under purchase services is not correct because the person is an employee. Well, if it's an employee, we'd be coded to personnel. And the problem is, I guess, what makes it confusing is that while the person may be communicating with groups, regardless of if it's a contracted provider or a person who's employed by the district, it's not a purchase of communication. It's actually the person's time that's being purchased. So whether it's a contract or personnel, it should be coded to time. Further, this person is not the CTE supervisor or coordinator, and so it shouldn't really be coded to that. The second example is better, but I'd still question if it's actually providing students with an experience. We can see in the description that the communication being purchased or the thing being purchased is video conferencing license, or printing costs would be appropriate as well. We've seen similar cases where meetings is indicated in the description, but that would not be correct either because you're not purchasing a meeting. So this is about what you are purchasing. It's not about the activity that's being done. So I hope that's as clear as mud for you. In this example, the applicant put a rationale for the purchase in the description field. This is not appropriate either. The rationale should be clear through your CLNA results and identified activities to address the root cause of your data gaps. Instead, the description should reflect what exactly is being purchased. So if it's a purchase service, what is the name of the conference? If it's transportation that's being purchased, is it a bus for students? If it's equipment, what is the name of the equipment? What's the type of equipment? Is it a stove? Is it a mixer? In the second example, what's being purchased is the required textbook for articulated credit course. That makes a lot of sense as you look across that string. These are the last two examples. These purchases are coded for other objects. Other objects is for anything that isn't required to be coded elsewhere. We narrow it down to dues and fees. But that's not every dues and fees, and everybody has a different definition of what dues and fees are. So I'm going to try and explain it. In the top example, the description of what is purchased doesn't align. Fees for testing are actually usually a purchase service. You're purchasing a service for an exam. You might have a contract for a certain number of tests or a license that you get to provide the test to students and then get the certificate. So it's not really a due and it's not really a fee. It's a contract that you have. In the second line, accounting competition isn't a purchase. It would have been more appropriate to put it under purchase service because it's probably this cost was a registration cost for a CTSO competition. And so that's where it should be. The only time pupil dues and fees would be used is for a fee. Let's say a student is being charged to take a class at school. So maybe it's a construction class and there's lumber and all these disposable type purchases, and there's a participation fee. And so that could be coded here. For students who are, again, it would be for economically disadvantaged students. The only other objects purchases for dues and fees would be for a student tour or a fee for a teacher to belong to an professional organization, let's say. So those are the typical 3 things that would fit under here. A fee to take a course, if students have economic need to do that. A fee for students to tour a facility like the Packer Stadium, I believe, has a fee that marketing students often go there, and there's a fee involved, or a fee for a teacher to belong to a professional organization. Everything that we talked about can be found on these resource links. I encourage you to digest them and then reach out as you have questions, either to your grant reviewer or to myself as questions come up. Thank you and have a great day.